The October night was cold and moonless when 5 university students approached the Virgin Mary statue that had stood there for over a century. Rashid Ahmed pulled out his phone, the screen's blue glow illuminating his cocky grin. "You recording this?" he asked Omar, who was already positioning his camera for the perfect angle. "Live stream's going," Omar replied, his voice trembling with excitement and nervous energy. "We've got 300 viewers already." The statue stood serenely in the center of the square, her marble face gazing down with eternal compassion at the town she had watched over since 1892. Fresh flowers lay at her feet, roses from Mrs. Patterson's garden, daisies picked by schoolchildren, a single white lily left by someone who had prayed for healing. "Look at this pathetic display," Rashid sneered, kicking at the offerings. "A whole town praying to a chunk of rock like it's going to solve their problems. If you want to know what happened next, the punishments, the haunting, and the miracle no one expected, make sure you like this video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment below with what you think should have happened to them. Your support helps us keep telling stories that prove justice always finds its way." Samir Hassan emerged from the shadows carrying a red gasoline canister, his eyes bright with anticipation. He'd always been fascinated by fire, had been since childhood, when he'd burned insects with magnifying glasses and progressed to setting small fires in vacant lots. Tonight felt like the culmination of all that destructive energy. "This is insane," Bilal whispered, hanging back near the edge of the square. He was the youngest of the group, barely 18, and everything about this felt wrong. But peer pressure was a powerful force, and he'd already come this far. "Shut up, Bilal," Karim laughed, his voice harsh in the still night air. "It's just stone and superstition. Your Mary can't hurt us because she doesn't exist." The live stream comments were flooding in now, some encouraging the destruction, others begging them to stop, a few threatening to call the police. Omar angled the camera to capture the statue from below, making it look imposing and ominous. "This is for everyone who's tired of religious nonsense controlling our lives," Rashid declared to the camera. "For everyone who's sick of being told what to believe, what to think, what to do. Tonight, we show you what your precious symbols are really worth." Samir began pouring gasoline around the statue's base, the acrid smell filling the air. The liquid splashed onto the flowers, soaking through prayer cards and handwritten notes left by the faithful. A child's drawing of the Virgin Mary, crayon strokes showing her surrounded by hearts, dissolved in the spreading fuel. "She can't touch me," Rashid boasted, moving closer to the statue. "None of their gods can, because I choose my own path." Bilal felt his stomach churning as he watched the gasoline pool around objects that clearly meant something to people. Photographs of the sick, rosary beads worn smooth by decades of prayer, a small teddy bear left by parents who had lost a child. "Come on, Bilal," Omar called, still filming. "Say something for the camera. Tell them what you think about their stone goddess." Bilal approached reluctantly, his hands shaking as he picked up a flower crown someone had left at the statue's feet. It was beautiful, white roses woven with baby's breath, clearly made with love and reverence. He started, then looked at Rashid's expectant face, at Omar's recording phone, at the viewer count climbing past 800. "I think people need to grow up and stop believing in fairy tales." He threw the crown into the gasoline, watching it land with a splash that soaked the delicate petals. Karim stepped forward, emboldened by the group's energy. "Your Mary is nothing but stone," he shouted at the statue, his voice echoing off the surrounding buildings. "Stone and lies and false hope for weak minds." For a moment, in the phone's harsh light, the statue's marble eyes seemed to shimmer with moisture. But it was just shadows and imagination, wasn't it? Samir pulled out his lighter, a cheap plastic thing he'd bought at a gas station. The flame danced in the darkness, small and innocent despite what it was about to unleash. "Wait," Bilal said suddenly. "What if someone sees the fire? What if nothing?" Rashid snapped. "Do it, Samir." "Light it up." The flame touched the gasoline. The fire erupted with a roar that sent them all stumbling backward. Orange flames climbed the statue's base, consuming the offerings in seconds. The flower crown Bilal had thrown burst into brilliant light before crumbling to ash. Prayer cards curled and blackened. Photographs of loved ones disappeared in seconds. They laughed, all of them, even Bilal, as the flames grew higher. The laughter felt good, felt liberating, felt like power. Omar kept filming, the camera shaking with his mirth as he captured their faces illuminated by the fire they had created. But as the flames reached higher, licking at the statue's marble robes, something impossible happened. Over the crackling of the fire and their own hysterical laughter, they heard another sound, soft at first, then growing clearer. Weeping, not human crying, but something deeper, more profound. The sound of sorrow that had witnessed humanity's cruelties for millennia. The grief of a mother watching her children destroy themselves. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the flames, from the statue, from the very stones of the square. "Do you hear that?" Bilal whispered, his laughter dying in his throat. "Hear what?" Rashid demanded, but his voice was less certain now. "Just the fire," Samir said, but he stepped back from the flames. "Just burning stuff." The weeping grew louder, more mournful, and for a terrifying moment, the statue's marble lips seemed to move. Not speaking, just trembling with infinite sadness as flames blackened her robes and cracked her face. "We should go," Bilal said, panic creeping into his voice. "We should go now." But Omar was still filming, mesmerized by the destruction. "This is incredible," he breathed. "Look at those flames. Look at that stone cracking. We're making history here." The viewer count had hit 2,000, comments flooding past too fast to read. But Omar wasn't looking at the screen anymore. He was staring at the statue, where the marble seemed to be shifting, changing, as if the fire was revealing something that had always been hidden beneath the stone. "She can't touch me," Rashid repeated, but his voice cracked on the words. "She's just rock, just dead rock." A piece of the statue's face fell away, revealing not the interior stone they expected, but something that looked almost organic, as if the marble had been wrapped around something alive, something that was now being exposed by the flames. "Jesus Christ," Kareem whispered, then laughed nervously at his own words. "I mean, not Jesus, obviously. There's nobody there to save her." But the weeping continued, and now they could all hear it clearly, a sound so full of grief that it made their bones ache. The fire began to die down as it consumed the last of the gasoline, but the sound lingered, echoing off the buildings and seeming to follow them as they finally turned and ran. Behind them, the statue burned through the night, and the weeping never stopped. Omar didn't turn off the live stream until they were 6 blocks away, hands shaking as he ended the broadcast that had been viewed by over 5,000 people. The last image captured was the statue silhouetted against the flames, her damaged face still somehow managing to convey infinite sorrow as she watched her children flee into the darkness. None of them looked back. None of them wanted to see what they had really done. But they would learn soon enough. 3 days after the burning, life seemed to return to normal for the 5 students. The video had gone viral, shared across social media platforms with hashtags like #religionisdead and #fakegods. Most comments were supportive of their brave act, calling them heroes for standing up to religious oppression. Rashid Ahmed basked in the attention from his dorm room at Millbrook University. At 21, he was the natural leader of their group. Charismatic, confident, always ready to push boundaries that others were afraid to cross. He came from a family of academics, his parents both professors who had raised him to question everything and bow to nothing. Their approval had always come through achievement, through being the best, the smartest, the most successful. Burning the statue felt like the ultimate achievement, proof that he was above the superstitions that held others back. "Look at these numbers," he told his roommate, scrolling through the video's analytics. 50,000 views and climbing. We're internet famous. His phone buzzed constantly with interview requests from podcasters and bloggers who wanted to discuss their act of liberation. Rashid scheduled 3 appearances for the following week, already crafting the narrative in his mind. 5 brave students standing up to religious tyranny, showing the world that sacred symbols had no real power. Omar Khalil was editing the footage in his apartment, adding dramatic music and slow motion effects to heighten the impact. At 19, he was the group's unofficial documentarian, always filming, always looking for the perfect shot that would make him famous. His Instagram account had gained 10,000 followers overnight, and brands were already reaching out about sponsorship deals. "This is just the beginning," he told his girlfriend over video call. "After this goes fully viral, I'll have the platform to make real change. Maybe get into film school, maybe start my own media company." He'd grown up middle class and invisible, the kind of kid teachers forgot about and classmates ignored. The camera had become his superpower, his way of mattering in a world that seemed determined to overlook him. The Virgin Mary video was his masterpiece, the content that would finally make people pay attention. Bilal Nazir couldn't sleep. At 18, he was the youngest and most conflicted member of the group, a freshman who'd been desperate to fit in with the cool older students who'd somehow noticed him. His parents had immigrated when he was 5, working double shifts to pay for his education, sacrificing everything so their son could have opportunities they'd never had. They called him every night, asking about his classes, his friends, his faith. He lied about all three. "I saw some video on the internet," his mother said during their Tuesday call. "Some students burning religious things. Promise me you stay away from people like that, Beta. Promise me you remember who you are." "I promise, Mama," he lied, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. The flower crown haunted his dreams, the way it had looked so carefully made, so full of love, before he'd thrown it into the gasoline. Someone had spent time creating that, had prayed over it, had left it as an offering, and he'd destroyed it for the approval of people who didn't really care about him. Samir Hassan was in his element. At 20, he'd already been suspended twice for setting small fires on campus. Experiments, he called them. The university had mandated counseling, but Samir had learned to tell the therapists what they wanted to hear while feeding his obsession in private. Fire was pure, he believed. It didn't lie or pretend or make false promises. It simply consumed, transformed, revealed truth. The Virgin Mary statue had been a perfect subject. Centuries of accumulated faith and superstition burned away in minutes, revealing the hollow emptiness beneath all religious belief. He kept the empty gasoline canister in his closet like a trophy, sometimes taking it out to smell the lingering fumes. The memory of those flames climbing the marble made his heart race with excitement and something deeper, something that felt almost sexual in its intensity. Kareem Okafor was the group's philosopher, though he would have cringed at the description. At 22, he was a senior majoring in sociology with a minor in religious studies. Not because he believed, but because he wanted to understand the psychological mechanisms that made people cling to obvious delusions. His parents were devout Muslims who had disowned him when he declared himself an atheist at 17. The rejection had hardened something in his heart, turning hurt into anger, anger into contempt for all forms of faith. Christians, Muslims, Jews, Hindus, they were all equally pathetic in his view, all equally deserving of having their illusions shattered. "The Virgin Mary represents the ultimate patriarchal fantasy," he wrote in his blog post about the burning. "The perfect woman, silent, submissive, and virginal. By destroying her image, we've struck a blow against thousands of years of female oppression disguised as religious devotion." The post was shared widely in academic circles, earning him praise from professors and peers who saw the statue's destruction as a legitimate form of social commentary. Kareem savoured every like, every comment, every retweet that validated his worldview. For 3 days, they were heroes in their own narrative. They had struck a blow against superstition, made a statement about free thought, created content that would define their generation's relationship with organised religion. But on the 4th day, the Virgin Mary began to answer back. It started with whispers. Rashid first heard them on Thursday night as he lay in bed scrolling through comments on their viral video. At first, he thought it was his roommate talking in his sleep, or maybe voices from the apartment next door bleeding through the thin walls. But the whispers were coming from inside his room, soft, feminine, speaking in a language he couldn't quite identify. Not Arabic, not English, something older, something that made his skin crawl with recognition despite not understanding a single word. "Jake, you awake?" he called to his roommate. Snoring was the only response. The whispers continued, seeming to come from his phone, from his laptop, from the very walls themselves. And underneath the incomprehensible words, he could hear something else. Crying. The same impossible weeping they'd heard in the square, following him into the sanctuary of his dorm room. He put in earbuds and cranked up music, but the whispers cut through Eminem and Drake like they were playing at the same volume as his playlist. When he finally fell asleep near dawn, his dreams were full of marble eyes that wept real tears. Omar's phone started malfunctioning the same night. He woke up to find it burning hot in his hand, the screen displaying images he'd never taken. Close-up shots of the Virgin Mary's face from angles that should have been impossible. In the photos, her marble features looked alive, animated by grief that seemed to reach through the screen. He tried to delete the images, but they multiplied faster than he could remove them. His camera roll filled with hundreds of pictures of the statue from before the burning, but not as she'd actually looked. In these images, she was weeping, her stone tears leaving dark stains on marble cheeks. "What the hell?" he muttered, trying to force restart the phone. But even powered down, the screen continued to glow faintly, displaying those impossible photographs in an endless slideshow of sorrow. When he finally managed to get the phone working normally the next morning, his followers were asking about the artistic photos he'd supposedly posted at 3 a.m. But Omar had no memory of posting anything, and when he checked his Instagram, the images weren't there, at least not for him. Bilal's apartment began to smell like smoke, not the clean scent of a fireplace or even cigarettes, but something acrid and wrong, like burning flowers, like destroyed beauty, like the exact moment when hope turns to ash. He checked every room, every electrical outlet, every possible source. The building's smoke detectors remained silent, and his neighbors noticed nothing unusual. But for Bilal, the smell was overwhelming, following him from room to room, clinging to his clothes and hair. When he showered, the bathroom filled with steam that reeked of gasoline and burning roses. When he tried to eat, food tasted like ash and regret. His mother called that night, concern heavy in her voice. "Beta, are you all right? You sound different." "I'm fine, Mama. Just tired from studying." "You remember to pray? Even if you're busy, you remember to talk to Allah?" The smell of smoke grew stronger as she spoke, and Bilal had to cover the phone's microphone to muffle his coughing. "Yes, Mama. I remember." But he hadn't prayed since high school, and the thought of attempting it now, with the phantom smoke burning his lungs, felt like blasphemy of the highest order. Samir's fascination with fire turned to dread when flames began appearing where they shouldn't exist. He woke Tuesday morning to find his lighter sitting in the middle of his kitchen table, burning with a flame that produced no heat and consumed no fuel. The fire danced without wind, flickered without cause, and when he reached for the lighter, his hand passed through both flame and plastic as if they were made of light. Throughout the day, more impossible fires appeared. A candle in his bathroom burned with no wick. Flames danced across his laptop screen, casting no reflection on the blank monitor. His stove's burners ignited themselves with blue fire that gave no warmth and produced no sound. The phantom fires followed him to classes, to the library, to the cafeteria. Only he could see them. Only he could smell their strange, scentless burning. When he tried to take pictures, the flames vanished from the photos. When he tried to describe them to friends, words failed him. How do you explain fire that burns without consuming, light that casts no shadow? By Thursday night, his apartment looked like a shrine to impossible combustion. Dozens of flameless fires burned in corners and on surfaces, reflected in mirrors but casting no warmth on his increasingly terrified face. Kareem heard stone cracking. It started as a subtle sound, just a tiny pop or snap that could have been the old building settling or pipes expanding. But the frequency increased until he was hearing it constantly. Crack, 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 like marble slowly giving way under invisible pressure. The sound followed him everywhere. In lectures, while professors discussed sociological theory, crack went the sound of stone fracturing. In the cafeteria, while he tried to eat lunch, crack, 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 until his temples throbbed with the rhythm. At night, while he attempted to study, the sound grew so loud he couldn't concentrate on his textbooks. His roommates claimed to hear nothing, even when Karim pointed directly at the source of the sound, which seemed to be everywhere and nowhere, as if the very air around him was made of stone that was slowly, inexorably breaking apart. By the weekend, he'd developed a nervous tic, flinching every time he heard the sound. His hands shook constantly, and he'd begun having panic attacks whenever the cracking grew particularly intense. "Maybe you should see a doctor," his girlfriend suggested after finding him crouched in his closet, hands pressed over his ears, muttering about stone and breaking and sounds that wouldn't stop. "It's not medical," Karim whispered. "It's something else. Something we did." On Sunday night, exactly 1 week after the burning, all 5 gathered in Rashid's dorm room to compare their experiences. They looked haggard, sleep-deprived, jumpy. The confident young men who had laughed at a burning statue were gone, replaced by nervous shadows of themselves. "This is psychological," Rashid insisted, though his voice lacked its usual conviction. "Group hysteria, shared guilt manifesting as hallucinations." "Then explain this," Omar said, showing them his phone. The screen displayed a message in an alphabet none of them recognized, characters that seemed to shift and move when viewed directly. "Restore what you have broken." "Hack job," Samir suggested, but his hands were shaking as he stared at the impossible text. "What about the fires?" Samir asked. "What about the sounds? The smells?" "Mass psychosis," Karim said, but he flinched as he spoke, hearing the crack of stone that none of the others could perceive. Collective delusion brought on by social media attention and underlying guilt. Bilal said nothing. He simply sat in the corner, surrounded by the phantom smell of burning flowers, wondering if his mother's prayers could somehow reach him here in this room full of lies and fear. They were still trying to rationalize their experiences when the real punishments began. Rashid's punishment began with his voice. The young man who had always commanded attention through charismatic speaking found himself unable to utter the words that had once made him feel powerful. Whenever he tried to boast, to brag, to assert his dominance over others, his throat would seize up completely. "She can't touch me," he attempted to say during a podcast interview about their viral video, but the words came out as barely audible whispers. The host asked him to speak up, but Rashid found he literally could not raise his voice above a whisper when discussing the burning. It wasn't a medical condition. Doctors found nothing wrong with his vocal cords. But his confident pronouncements about religion being superstition for weak minds emerged as pathetic whimpers. His boasts about being above their pathetic beliefs sounded like the mutterings of a frightened child. The selective muteness was precise in its targeting. He could speak normally about classes, about food, about mundane topics. But any attempt at the arrogant declarations that had once defined his personality left him voiceless and humiliated. His followers began to drift away as his social media presence became increasingly tentative. The confident leader, who had promised to show them what their symbols are really worth, now posted hesitant, whispered videos that made him seem weak and uncertain. Worst of all, in his dreams, he stood repeatedly before the burning statue, trying to shout his defiance, only to find himself mute while the Virgin Mary's marble eyes watched him with infinite patience and sorrow. Omar's punishment manifested through his technology. Every device he touched, phones, cameras, laptops, tablets, began malfunctioning in ways that destroyed his ability to create content. Not through physical damage, but through digital sabotage that seemed almost supernatural in its precision. His phone's camera would only capture images of religious iconography, no matter what he tried to photograph. Pointed at a sunset, and the image would show a church window. Try to film a friend, and the recording would display footage of people praying. Attempt a selfie, and his own face would be replaced by images of the Virgin Mary, always weeping, always watching. His followers began commenting on the weird religious phase he was going through, not understanding that Omar had no control over what his devices recorded or uploaded. His Instagram filled with images of churches, crosses, and statues, content he never remembered creating but couldn't delete. His laptop's video editing software rebelled against him, replacing every cut and transition with footage from the statue burning. No matter what project he tried to work on, the final render would show only flames consuming marble, accompanied by the sound of impossible weeping. Tech support found nothing wrong with his equipment. The devices functioned perfectly for other people, only malfunctioning when Omar tried to use them. His dreams of internet fame crumbled as his online presence became increasingly bizarre and religious, the exact opposite of the atheistic content that had made him famous. The tools he had used to mock sacred things now served only to remind him of what he had destroyed, transforming every attempt at creation into an echo of his destruction. Bilal's punishment was gentler, but no less devastating. He became unable to bring beauty into the world. Every flower he approached began to wilt, not through any supernatural force, but through what seemed like his own overwhelming anxiety and guilt. His nervous sweating, his shaking hands, his fearful breathing somehow created microclimates of stress that delicate plants couldn't survive. But the real punishment was psychological. He became obsessed with the flower crown he had thrown into the flames, the lovingly crafted circle of white roses that someone had spent hours creating as an offering. The memory haunted him constantly, replaying in perfect detail during every quiet moment. He tried to learn flower arranging, hoping to atone by creating beauty instead of destroying it. But his attempts were disasters. Not because of supernatural interference, but because his guilt made his hands shake, his focus scatter, his artistic vision blur with tears he couldn't stop. His girlfriend left him not because plants died around him, but because he became obsessed with apologizing for things she didn't understand. He would weep over wilted flowers in shop windows, spend hours staring at pictures of flower arrangements online, wake up in the middle of the night whispering apologies to the empty air. His mother noticed the change when he could no longer bear to look at her garden. "It's too beautiful," he would whisper, turning away from the roses she tended so carefully. "I don't deserve to see things that beautiful anymore." The punishment wasn't that he destroyed beauty, it was that he could no longer believe himself worthy of it. Samir's obsession with fire transformed into its complete opposite, a paralyzing terror that left him unable to function in a world full of flames. The phantom fires he had seen since the burning grew more frequent and realistic until he could no longer distinguish between real flames and hallucinations. Candles, lighters, even the pilot light on his stove became sources of panic that sent him fleeing from rooms. But the real punishment was deeper than simple phobia. Samir found himself completely unable to create warmth in his life, literally and metaphorically. He couldn't light candles for ambiance, couldn't build campfires with friends, couldn't even use a gas stove to cook for himself. His apartment grew cold and lifeless as he removed every potential source of flame. He ate only cold food, lived without candles or mood lighting, avoided restaurants with open kitchens. His social life disappeared as friends grew tired of accommodating his increasingly bizarre restrictions. The obsession that had once made him feel powerful, his fascination with fire's transformative properties, now made him feel weak and helpless. He who had poured gasoline with gleeful anticipation now cowered at the sight of birthday candles. In his dreams, he stood again in the town square. But this time, he was the one burning, while the statue watched with sorrowful compassion. He would wake up screaming, covered in sweat, unable to escape the terror of flames that existed only in his mind but felt completely real. Kareem's punishment was auditory, the constant sound of stone cracking that followed him everywhere, growing louder and more insistent with each passing day. At first, it was subtle enough that he could almost ignore it. But the sound grew until it overwhelmed his ability to concentrate, study, or engage with the world around him. Lectures became impossible to follow over the crack, crack, crack of invisible stone fracturing. Social interactions were strained as he constantly flinched at sounds only he could hear. The psychological toll was enormous. The confident young man who had shouted, "Your Mary is nothing but stone," found himself reduced to a nervous wreck who jumped at every real sound, convinced it was more evidence of cracking, breaking, falling. His academic work suffered as he became unable to focus on reading or writing. His relationships crumbled as he became increasingly paranoid and isolated. His blog posts grew erratic and fearful, a far cry from the confident philosophical declarations that had once earned him praise. The breaking sounds seemed to emanate from inside his own skull, as if his certainty about the world was literally cracking apart piece by piece. The rational materialist worldview that had once made him feel superior to believers was fracturing under the weight of experiences he couldn't explain or dismiss. Sleep became impossible as the sounds grew louder at night. He would lie awake listening to stone breaking somewhere in the darkness, knowing that dawn would bring no relief from the auditory hallucinations that had taken over his life. In his most terrified moments, he wondered if the sounds represented his own faith. Not religious faith, but faith in his ability to understand the world, slowly, inexorably cracking apart. 2 months after the burning, all 5 of them remained physically unharmed but psychologically shattered. They met in Rashid's dorm room, a group of young men who had once felt invincible, now reduced to nervous shadows of their former selves. Rashid spoke in whispers, his once commanding voice reduced to barely audible murmurs whenever he tried to discuss their viral fame. Omar clutched a broken phone that displayed only religious imagery. His dreams of content creation turned into a nightmare of unwanted spiritual symbolism. Bilal sat surrounded by the phantom smell of burning flowers, unable to look at the wilted plant on Rashid's windowsill. Samir flinched at every flicker of the room's overhead lights, his former fire obsession transformed into paralyzing fear. Karim covered his ears periodically, trying to block out the sound of cracking stone that only he could hear. "We have to do something," Bilal whispered, his voice hoarse from constant anxiety. "This isn't going to stop. It's going to keep getting worse until we completely break." "Until what?" Rashid attempted to demand, but his words came out as pathetic whispers. "Until we're all completely insane? Until we can't function at all?" "Maybe that's the point," Omar said, staring at his phone screen where images of weeping saints flickered endlessly. "Maybe she wants us to understand what we destroyed by destroying our peace of mind piece by piece." They sat in miserable silence. 5 young men who had once felt intellectually superior to believers, now reduced to cowering victims of their own psychological torment. Around them, other students laughed and studied and planned their futures that seemed impossibly distant from their current reality. "The church," Bilal said suddenly. "We need to go to the church where the statue was blessed, where it came from originally." "What's the point?" Rashid whispered. "It's just a building. Just more symbols we don't believe in." "Maybe," Bilal admitted. "But what if we're wrong about everything we thought we knew? What if our rational worldview doesn't explain what's happening to us?" The journey to St. Catherine's Church required all their combined courage just to leave their safe spaces. Rashid's whispered voice made ordering an Uber humiliating. Omar's malfunctioning phone provided directions that led them through every church in the city. Bilal's anxiety spiked whenever they passed flower shops. Samir panicked at every flame they encountered. Street lamps, car headlights, even the warm glow from restaurant windows. Karim heard stone cracking in every footstep on concrete sidewalks. The church was older than they'd expected, built in the 1800s with Gothic architecture that made their small group feel even more insignificant. Evening services were ending as they arrived, parishioners filing out with the peaceful expressions of people whose faith remained intact. Expressions the 5 young men could barely remember having themselves. Father McKenna, the elderly priest who had blessed the original statue decades earlier, agreed to speak with them despite their obvious distress. He was a small man with kind eyes who seemed unsurprised by their appearance or their fragmented account of their experiences. "I heard about what happened," he said gently, gesturing for them to sit in the front pew. "The whole town heard about it. Many people were hurt by what you did." "We know," Bilal said. "We're paying for it now in ways we never expected." "Are you?" Father McKenna asked. "Or are you simply experiencing the natural consequences of violating something sacred to others?" Rashid tried to speak with his former confidence, but only whispers emerged. "Natural? You think what's happening to us has natural explanations?" "I think," the priest said carefully, "that when we damage something sacred, whether we believe in its power or not, we damage something within ourselves as well. The guilt, the fear, the sense that we've crossed a line we can't uncross. These are natural responses to destructive acts. He stood and walked to a side altar where a smaller statue of the Virgin Mary stood surrounded by flowers and flickering candles. This one was different from the statue they'd burned. More modern, carved from wood instead of marble, with a face that seemed both sorrowful and hopeful. The statue you destroyed had been blessed by 3 different bishops over its century of existence, Father McKenna explained. It had received the prayers of thousands of people, had been touched by the tears of grieving mothers, had witnessed marriages and baptisms and funerals. It wasn't just stone, it was a repository of faith, hope, and love. But it was just a statue, Omar protested, his voice cracking. Just a symbol that shouldn't have had any power over rational people like us. Symbols have power, the priest replied. Not supernatural power, but the power of meaning, of connection, of shared reverence. When you destroyed that statue, you didn't just burn marble, you violated the sacred space in your own hearts, the part of every human soul that recognizes when something deserves reverence rather than mockery. For the first time since the burning, the oppressive psychological symptoms each young man carried seemed to lighten slightly. Rashid found he could speak in a normal voice when discussing their pain rather than their pride. Omar's phone displayed a clear image of the church interior. Bilal didn't smell phantom smoke. Samir wasn't terrified by the church's votive candles. Kareem heard only peaceful silence. "What do we do?" Bilal asked finally. "How do we make this stop? How do we find peace again?" Father McKenna smiled sadly. "I think you already know. The question is whether you have the humility to do what's necessary. Not because you believe in the statue's power, but because you recognize the pain you've caused." As if summoned by his words, a profound sense of presence filled the church. Not supernatural, but deeply psychological. The weight of collective human sorrow and forgiveness. The young men felt it simultaneously. The grief of everyone who had ever found comfort at the destroyed statue, and underneath that grief, the possibility of redemption. "Restore what you have broken," seemed to whisper through their consciousness, or remain broken yourselves. The message wasn't a supernatural command, but a psychological truth they could no longer deny. And for the first time since the burning, they felt something other than fear or torment. They felt the possibility of healing. The fundraising began with Rashid selling everything he owned. His gaming setup, his designer clothes, his laptop, his car. Everything went to pay for the new statue. His parents, initially baffled by their son's sudden change from arrogant atheist to humble penitent, gradually came to understand that something profound had shifted in his worldview. "You're really going to do this?" his mother asked, watching him transfer money from his savings account to the church's restoration fund. "You're going to rebuild what you destroyed?" "I have to," Rashid said, his voice finally strong and clear when discussing redemption rather than rebellion. "We all have to. It's the only way we'll ever have peace again." Omar liquidated his social media presence, selling his accounts, his equipment, everything that had once defined his identity as a content creator. The devices that had tortured him with unwanted religious imagery suddenly began functioning normally when he used them for constructive purposes instead of destructive ones. "I'm documenting the rebuilding process," he explained to his confused followers. "Not for fame this time, just because it needs to be recorded. Because people need to see that destruction doesn't have to be permanent." Bilal threw himself into learning about horticulture and flower arrangement, spending every free moment studying the art of creating beauty instead of destroying it. His panic attacks around flowers gradually subsided as he focused on giving rather than taking. His mother wept when she received the botanical drawings he sent her. Detailed sketches of the flower crown he remembered destroying, recreated from memory and guilt and desperate hope for forgiveness. "You're remembering how to see beauty again, Beta," she whispered during their phone call. "I can hear it in your voice." Samir overcame his terror of fire by channeling it into something constructive. He became obsessed with the technical aspects of metalworking and stone carving, skills needed for the statue's restoration. Every time he faced his fear of flame, using torches for welding, operating kilns for metalwork, he thought of the Virgin Mary's patient sorrow instead of his own panic. Fire creates as well as destroys. he told his therapist during one breakthrough session. I just had to remember that I could choose which one. Kareem's constant sound of cracking stone began to shift into something else. Not breaking, but building. He heard the sounds of construction, of restoration, of healing. His blog, which had once mocked faith, became a thoughtful exploration of how rational people could find meaning in acts of reverence. I was wrong about weakness and strength, he wrote in his final post about the experience. It takes more courage to build something beautiful than to tear it down. More strength to serve something greater than yourself than to mock what others find sacred. The community's response surprised them all. Instead of rejection and anger, they found cautious acceptance and even support. People who had been hurt by the statue's destruction were moved by the young men's obvious transformation and genuine remorse. Mrs. Patterson, whose roses had been planted around the original statue, offered to design the garden for the new one. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting, she told them. It's about choosing to help someone become better than they were. Were.